Something has shifted in California's economic landscape, and it's happening faster than most people realize. Tesla, one of the state's most visible corporate success stories, has just announced plans to close a major manufacturing facility, a decision that's sending quiet shockwaves through Sacramento and beyond. This isn't about politics or headlines. It's about what happens when a company that employs thousands of people, anchors entire supply chains, and symbolizes California's tech industrial ambitions decides to pull back. Governor Newsom's office has been notably measured in its response, which tells you something in itself. The closure raises immediate questions about where those jobs go, what it signals about California's business climate, and whether this is an isolated move or the beginning of a broader trend. We're not talking about speculation here. This is a concrete development with real consequences for workers, communities, and the state's economic identity. What led to this decision? What does it mean for California's manufacturing future? And perhaps most importantly, what comes next for the thousands of families whose livelihoods just became uncertain? Let's start with what we know for certain. Tesla has confirmed that it will be closing its manufacturing operations at a significant facility in California. And while the company hasn't released every detail publicly, the scale of this decision is substantial enough that it's already reshaping conversations in state government, among labor groups, and within the broader manufacturing sector. This isn't a small adjustment or a temporary suspension. This is a permanent closure that will displace workers, alter local economies, and force some difficult questions about California's position in the national and global manufacturing landscape. To understand why this matters so much, you have to step back and look at what Tesla represented for California over the past 2 decades. When the company established its manufacturing presence in the state, it wasn't just about building electric vehicles. It was about reimagining what American manufacturing could look like in the 21st century. California positioned itself as the natural home for this kind of innovation. The state had the tech talent, the venture capital, the regulatory environment that favored clean energy, and the cultural appetite for disruption. Tesla became a symbol of that convergence, a proof of concept that you could build advanced manufacturing operations in a high-cost state if the product and the vision were compelling enough. Thousands of jobs were created. Entire supply chains developed around the facilities, and local communities built their economic planning around the presence of these operations. But over the past several years, things have been changing quietly. Tesla began expanding aggressively outside of California, building major new facilities in Texas, Nevada, and beyond. At the time, company leadership framed this as growth, not replacement. The California operations would continue, they said, while new capacity came online elsewhere. And for a while, that seemed to be the case. But now we're seeing the other side of that equation. When a company builds massive new capacity in states with lower operating costs, fewer regulatory hurdles, and more favorable tax structures, the existing facilities in higher cost environments start to look less essential. It's not that California suddenly became a bad place to do business overnight. It's that the competitive landscape shifted and the calculus changed. The timing of this announcement is particularly significant because it comes at a moment when California is already grappling with larger questions about its economic model. The state has seen a notable exodus of corporate headquarters and major business operations over the past few years. Some of this has been high-profile, companies like Oracle and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise relocating their headquarters to Texas. Some of it has been quieter, mid-sized firms gradually shifting operations or choosing to expand elsewhere rather than in California. The reasons vary depending on who you ask. Business groups point to high taxes, complex regulatory environments, and operating costs that make it difficult to compete. State officials and labor advocates argue that California offers a quality of life, a talent pool, and an innovation ecosystem that you simply can't replicate elsewhere, and that companies leave at their own peril. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, which is exactly why this issue is so complicated and so contentious. What makes the Tesla closure different from a typical corporate relocation is the symbolism involved. This isn't a legacy industrial company that's been slowly declining for decades. This is a company that was built in the modern era, that chose California deliberately, and that became intertwined with the state's identity as a hub for the future economy. When a company like that decides to pull back, it raises questions that go beyond the immediate economic impact. It makes people wonder whether the model that California has been pursuing, the idea that you can maintain a high-cost, highly regulated environment and still attract cutting-edge industries because of intangible advantages, is actually sustainable in the long term. Governor Newsom's response to the announcement has been carefully calibrated, which is worth noting. There hasn't been a dramatic public confrontation or an attempt to paint Tesla as a villain. Instead, the focus has been on supporting affected workers, exploring options for the facility, and emphasizing California's continued strengths. That's a pragmatic approach, but it also reflects a certain reality. California is in a difficult position here. The state can't simply lower its tax rates or eliminate environmental regulations to compete with Texas or Nevada on those terms, nor would many Californians want it to. But it also can't ignore the fact that companies are making decisions based on concrete economic factors, and those decisions are having real consequences. Let's talk about what this means for the workers directly affected by the closure. We're looking at thousands of people whose employment is tied to this facility. Some of them have been with the company for years, building expertise in advanced manufacturing processes, battery technology, and electric vehicle production. These are skilled positions, not easily replaceable, and the workers who hold them are now facing uncertainty about their futures. Tesla has indicated that it will provide severance packages and support for workers transitioning to other opportunities, but that only goes so far. If you've built a life around a stable manufacturing job in a specific location, the prospect of starting over somewhere else or shifting to an entirely different industry is daunting. And it's not just the direct employees who are affected. Think about the suppliers, the service companies, the local businesses that depend on those workers spending their paychecks in the community. When a major employer like this closes down, the ripple effects extend far beyond the factory floor. There's also a broader question about what happens to manufacturing in California more generally. The state has been trying for years to position itself as a leader in advanced manufacturing, the kind of high-tech, high-value production that can justify higher operating costs because of the innovation and quality involved. Electric vehicles, renewable energy technology, aerospace components, these were supposed to be the sectors where California could compete and thrive. But if even the flagship companies in these industries are finding it more attractive to build and expand elsewhere, what does that say about the viability of that strategy? It doesn't necessarily mean the strategy is wrong, but it does mean that the execution is being challenged in real time by market forces. Part of what's happening here is a fundamental tension in California's political economy. The state has prioritized certain values and policy goals: environmental protection, labor rights, consumer safety, public health, and these priorities have led to a regulatory framework that is more extensive and more complex than what you find in most other states. Supporters of this approach argue that it's necessary and that it produces better outcomes for people and the environment. Critics argue that it creates friction and cost that make it harder for businesses to operate efficiently. The Tesla closure doesn't definitively prove either side right, but it does illustrate the real-world trade-offs involved. When a company decides that the benefits of operating in California no longer outweigh the costs, the reasons are usually multiple and interconnected. It's not just taxes or just regulations or just cost of living. It's the cumulative burden of all these factors together. Now let's consider what this means for California's fiscal situation. The state budget relies heavily on income taxes, particularly from high earners, and corporate taxes from major employers. When large companies reduce their presence in the state, that has direct revenue implications. It's not catastrophic. In the short term, California's economy is enormous and diversified, but it's part of a pattern that state officials have to be watching carefully. If more companies follow Tesla's lead, if more high-income workers relocate to lower-tax states, if more capital investment flows elsewhere, the fiscal consequences could become more severe over time. And that creates a difficult feedback loop, because if the state faces budget pressures, the temptation is to raise taxes or cut services, both of which can accelerate the trends you're trying to reverse. There's also a political dimension to this that can't be ignored. California's leadership has been increasingly at odds with certain business interests over the past several years, and that relationship has been strained by policy disagreements on everything from labor law to environmental standards to pandemic response. Some business leaders feel that their concerns aren't being heard or taken seriously by state policymakers. Some state officials feel that business groups are exaggerating problems and resisting necessary changes. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. But what's clear is that the relationship between the state government and the business community is not as collaborative as it once was. And that creates an environment where companies may be more inclined to look elsewhere for growth opportunities. It's worth considering what the alternatives might look like. If California wanted to reverse this trend and make itself more attractive to manufacturing operations, what would that actually require? The simplest answer would be to reduce costs and regulatory complexity, but that's easier said than done. Tax cuts would require either spending cuts or finding new revenue sources. Regulatory reform would face opposition from environmental groups, labor unions, and other constituencies that benefit from existing protections. And even if the political will existed to make significant changes, it's not clear that it would be enough to fundamentally alter the competitive landscape. Texas and other states have structural advantages that go beyond policy, lower cost of living, cheaper land, different political cultures. California can't simply copy their model without ceasing to be California. Another approach would be to double down on the things that make California unique and try to attract industries and companies that value those attributes enough to accept the higher costs. This is essentially the strategy the state has been pursuing, emphasizing innovation, talent, quality of life, and access to capital. It works for some sectors, particularly technology and entertainment, but it's proving more challenging for manufacturing, where cost structures and operational efficiency matter more. The question is whether California can find a sustainable niche in manufacturing, or whether the state's future is primarily in services, technology, and knowledge work, with physical production happening elsewhere. What happens to the facility itself after Tesla closes it down is another open question. These are valuable assets, specialized equipment, trained workforce, established infrastructure. There's potential for another company to acquire the facility and continue manufacturing operations, possibly in a different industry or with a different product. State and local officials will likely be working to attract such an outcome, offering incentives and support to any company willing to maintain employment at the site. But there are no guarantees. In other cases around the country, when major manufacturing facilities close, they sometimes sit vacant for years, becoming symbols of industrial decline rather than seeds of renewal. California will want to avoid that outcome, but avoiding it requires finding a buyer or tenant willing to make significant commitments in a state that just saw a major manufacturer decide to leave. The broader national context matters here too. The United States as a whole has been grappling with questions about manufacturing competitiveness for decades. There was a time when American manufacturing was leaving not just for other states, but for other countries, seeking lower labor costs and fewer regulations overseas. In recent years, there's been more focus on reshoring, bringing production back to the United States for reasons of supply chain security, quality control, and national economic policy. But reshoring doesn't necessarily mean returning to the same locations where manufacturing once thrived. Companies bringing production back to America are often choosing states in the South and Southwest that offer more favorable business climates. So California is competing not just against other countries, but against other American states. And that's a competition where the rules and incentives are complex and constantly shifting. For everyday Californians watching this unfold, the Tesla closure is a reminder that economic security isn't guaranteed, even in a prosperous state with a massive economy. It's a reminder that policy choices have consequences, sometimes consequences that take years to fully materialize. And it's a reminder that the relationship between government and business, between regulation and growth, between values and competitiveness, requires constant balancing and recalibration. There are no easy answers here, no simple solutions that would satisfy everyone, but there are real stakes, real jobs, real communities affected by these decisions. What comes next will depend on how multiple actors respond. Will California's political leadership recognize this as a warning sign and pursue meaningful reforms to make the state more competitive for manufacturing? Will business groups engage constructively in finding solutions rather than simply criticizing? Will workers and communities affected by the closure receive adequate support and new opportunities? Will other companies see this as an isolated incident or as evidence that they should reconsider their own California operations? The answers to these questions will shape California's economic trajectory for years to come. This is a moment that demands clear thinking, honest assessment, and a willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. California has enormous strengths, a talented workforce, world-class universities, a culture of innovation, access to capital, natural beauty that attracts talent from around the world. But it also has challenges, high costs, complex regulations, political polarization, infrastructure needs. The Tesla closure doesn't negate the strengths, but it does highlight the challenges. And the question facing the state now is whether it can address those challenges while preserving the values and qualities that make California what it is. That's not an easy balance to strike, but it's the task at hand. The decisions made in the coming months and years will determine whether this closure is remembered as an inflection point that led to positive change or as the beginning of a longer, more painful decline in California's manufacturing sector.